Everybody, and welcome to the third panel discussion for the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. This is a campaign organized by the Vaishnava Ministry, who is hosting a series of discussions identifying abuse within our ISKCON communities and how we can address it. Today, we're talking about how we can support victims of abuse, and our two guest speakers are Rambhoru Prabhu, the founder of Karuna Care Education and a trained chaplain, and Keshava Madhava, an occupational therapist who focuses on stabilizing patients with post-traumatic stress disorder and other clinical disorders. We are very grateful for them both joining us. We know that they're both professionals and they've got very full schedules, but they also have a lot of knowledge and experience which they can share with us. Now, to start off our conversation, we want to discuss why we often see that people who are abused, victims of abuse, who are also aware that they're being abused, stay in the situations or stay in the relationships of abuse. So, Rambhoru Prabhu, could you maybe share with us what is your experience in dealing with this phenomenon?
Yeah, it's a hard topic. What I've noticed is that people, women particularly, who are in abusive relationships, they have this idea that they love the person who's abusing them, and they truly believe that they love them, and that abuser even loves them. But they also have in the back of their mind that they have the power to change them. And so they always are living with this hope. And then there's a cycle, there's the abuse, then the abuser is very apologetic, perhaps even horrified, like Kamsa was horrified when he was so abusive, and he'd come and he'd grovel and cry, and then he'd do it again. And so there's this kind of cycle, and it doesn't stop. And there's this notion of powerlessness. The more a person is abused, the woman is feeling more and more powerless. And there's something perhaps not even healthy, but this notion that their abuser is the powerful one. And, certainly if you have no finances, you have no funding, there's no real way to leave unless you become homeless or I live in your car. If you have children also, that's another thing that makes it really hard to leave when you kind of need to, because emotionally you're thinking, gosh, I don't want my children to be raised without a father. I also don't know where I'm going with these children without finances and a home. So all of those things make it really complex. And the other thing is that research shows that many women who attempt to leave an abusive relationship become murdered by their abuser, because the need to control by the abuser is so triggered that they will just stalk you until they kill you. And so it's a very dangerous thing to leave an abuser for an abused woman. Those are just some points that come to mind. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think what you highlighted is one very important point, which I think outsiders might not be conscious of, is that there might be a lot of practical considerations which makes it very challenging for a person to leave an abusive situation. Because often we hear people say, why don't they just leave? But it's not as easy as just leaving.
No.
But often there's a threat of economic stability, social stability, and even as you said, it can be a life-threatening situation depending on the severity of the abuse. Just one point that I wanted to touch on, you also mentioned that a victim might feel that the abuser loves them, and they might feel that they love the abuser. Is it impossible for someone to be abusive and at the same time love a person?
Well, yeah, there's all kinds of reasons why a person might be abusive. I mean, they may have typically been abused themselves. Violent people are often recipients of violence, particular childhood abuse. Then they are repeating what has been done to them. And if they can get some kind of therapy, and get some healing for themselves, there's maybe a hope. just like an addiction. I mean, really, this cycle of abuse it has the same kind of addictive pattern that people who are addicted to porn and drugs have, and it's very seductive. And they think they're going to be good, but then they get triggered and there's an impulse thing. So yeah, there's this notion, but also the person who's being abused has to think in terms of, how am I feeling in relationship? Even though there's this romantic idea of love, is it love truly? And do you have to be physically with the person in order to love? Sometimes love is really having a period of separation and loving at a distance in order to remain safe. But very hard to get away once you've been enmeshed in that relationship.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think it's very wise that we can, even though we might feel we love someone, we could still know that we needed to remove ourselves from the situation. So I think that is also there.
Because if
Keshava
you,
Madhava,
just one last
sorry,
thing,
Natalie.
if you don't do that, then you're enabling the person to continue abusing. It really doesn't help them to continue. Just like if you have an alcoholic husband or parent, to just keep supplying them the alcohol, it doesn't really help them if they're serious about freeing themselves from that addiction. That's all I want to say.
Also, if you love them, it's beneficial for both of you in the long term to not enable them to continue the abuse, because it can be a continuous cycle then that also affects children and more generations in the future.
Absolutely, yeah.
Keshava Madhava Prabhu, is there anything you'd like to add to reasons why you've seen people struggle to leave abusive relationships?
You're muted.
Yes, so I think the most vital points have been mentioned very clearly and concisely. An additional thing could be like that there is the idea, I better have something bad than nothing. That women also feel like, okay, this might be bad, but it would be worse if I have no one to be with. And that's also a very toxic kind of self-esteem issue, or like lack of faith. There's often a mentality of fear and scarcity, that people stay in relationships that are not good for them, but they feel it's the only thing I have. So it's very tragic, but this could also be one of these dynamics that keep a person, or a woman in particular, or be with a man that actually is abusing her.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that was a very insightful point. I think I've definitely seen this where someone has expressed that they feel they're better off with the person because they get some benefit, whether that is just having someone in their life or feeling that there's some stability, although they know it is bad. Could you maybe share, if you've got any further insight to where that comes from, that conviction that, being in an abusive relationship is better than, just being on your own? What do you think is the root?
Well, with this point, I might share, like I mentioned this because I had firsthand experience, so to speak, in my family, and my mother and my father. My father was alcoholic as well, and I experienced domestic violence firsthand, and that was also her issue. One of her things, she felt like, whom do I have then? And also that's something that's part of her life. I mean, it traces back, of course, to her upbringing and crucial certain childhood experiences. Maybe there could be an experience of early abandonment that like is triggered by, I'm completely left alone. And this, like Rambhoru Mataji mentioned, that the power imbalance or sense of disempowerment, it's not to be underestimated how much this can drive people's decision-making, their life, because if I feel powerless, then I'm very prone to make myself dependent on someone who appears powerful. And this could be something, even if it's an aggressor who is destructive with his power, still it's someone there, and I have someone to be connected to. And yes, it's the inability to be with yourself and feel okay to be alone, and not equating it with I'm lonely. That's something, it's a bit subtle, but yeah, if there are experiences that make you very scared of being alone, then these have to be addressed, I guess, in a setting that allows for a deeper, how to say, to deal deeper with this.
I want to piggyback on that. Just a quick something I'd like to say is that, people really fear isolation and loneliness, which is the root cause of mental health issues, and our need as social beings to belong and feel ourselves cared for by someone is so great that you'd almost tolerate anything not to be alone. And as Keshava was mentioning, there's a real difference between solitude, which is nourishing, and loneliness and isolation. Sometimes we have this fear of being alone, especially once you're kind of middle-aged, or you've had kids, or you've been established. Very hard to think of yourself now finding another partner. Most people don't want to marry someone who has already had kids. They want their own kids. They don't want to take care of your kids. And also, if you're trying to connect with people and you're used to being a stay-at-home mom, how do you find people to connect with? Most people by a certain age are married, and gosh, today people live on their internet or their phones. They are not interacting physically in ways. We've had COVID. And so, yeah, I would agree. People think better something than nothing, but maybe that's not a good solution.
Thank you so much. I think what really stood out is that we are inherently social beings, and everyone needs to be part of a network. And even if someone is part of a network or a situation which is unhealthy, we would tend to prefer that to being isolated. Because I think being isolated, it feels to us like we're going to die. Although we won't die, it feels like we can't exist. And I think what Keshava Prabhu pointed out very well is that if someone is in a situation of abuse, there's quite a big chance that they ended up in that situation because they have, certain healing which they still have to go through within themselves. So they allowed themselves, to be in that situation, or they chose that situation because of certain previous traumatic experiences, which shows that if we want to help people get out of abusive situations, they probably would need to heal, on many levels, to feel empowered, so they can move out of the situation.
Right. It's very complex.
Thank you. One thing I want to say, we did cover quite in detail, actually, the reasons why somebody might choose to stay in an abusive relationship or a situation. So I just wanted to pick up the point that, assuming that somebody, for whatever personal reason they decide to stay in an abusive relationship, what impact does this have on that abused victim's identity? Maybe if I want to start with Rambhoru Prabhu first, and then I can go to Keshava Madhava Prabhu.
Well, what I'm imagining happens is that if you have to stay in an abusive relationship, you have to develop a persona that allows you to do that. That's not the real you. You have to hide. You have to lie to yourself. You have to lie to the person who's abusing you. You have to flee. Fighting probably isn't the best thing to do with your abuser, but appeasing, groveling, being a yes man, even if you're totally violating your own values, doing whatever it takes. It's actually really humiliating. The thought of being a slave in a relationship, particularly a marital relationship that's supposed to be a life companion, loving friend, forget about the idea of love. If the relationship is such a power over controlling, we cannot really say it's a love relationship. It's a slave master type of relationship, very unhealthy. And I suspect gradually what happens in the isolation, these self-sacrificing victims, they develop all kinds of physical ailments. The body is somatizing unprocessed trauma and grief, the loss of trust. You lose the ability to trust yourself. You now start to believe that I have no value, and yes, my abuser, whatever, I deserve it. And, you know, you just roll over, die. I've seen it. It's really shocking. And you lose the ability to be in touch with the core of yourself, and even super soul who's living in you, who might have long ago urged you, get out, do something, but you have had to deny that to the point that you can no longer hear the voice of your super self telling you the truth. You know, you've just had to smother the real you for so long. You're the living dead, basically. Like, it's just a terrible, then you die, like it's your life, and you get to be old and hollow, empty, very unhappy.
No, thank you, Rambhoru. But I think one thing that you said that really struck a chord is violating your values, because I have seen in professional context, you know, just come across colleagues, and you said you're lying to the point about you lie to yourself and the person that's abusing you, because you've often seen victims of abuse come in many different forms, and some of these people, you know, put up a really good front so that on the outset it looks like they're in a very happy, cozy, you know, playing happy families. But lo and behold, you know, nobody knows what's happening behind the closed doors, because, like you said, they put up such a front, you know, violating their values and putting that facade for whatever reason, often to get through the trauma themselves, you know. So I think that point about, you know, them self-sacrificing was just really, really pertinent, because I've firsthand seen this. You know, if I saw that lady, she was very, you know, high performing at work, and nobody would have ever thought, you know, she was in such an abusive situation. So you know, it's often not what you see, you know. Keshava Madhava, is there anything you wanted to touch base on, what impact somebody being in an abusive situation has on their individual identity?
Well, again, I think Rambhoru very clearly covered some really vital points in this regard. The word persona stayed with me, wearing a mask, because yes, it's, if the aggressor is like very, very violent one, of course the victim tries to appease, also tries strategies. How can I kind of keep it from escalating too much, although it doesn't necessarily work, but still there's part of you that will become like kind of she said, obedient servant, but also the surrendered kind of helpless being, you know, to the overly powerful person. If you talk of PTSD, for example, then there's this term introject. We have this introjection. This is the opposite of projection, that you externalize things, but we all do that naturally because we take in values and behaviors of our parents and so on. But there's also the idea in terms of identity that we adopt certain attitudes and beliefs and behaviors of the abuser. We internalize them and have, so to say, an abuser representation within ourselves, that where we treat ourselves as the abuser does. That's depending how complex and strong the PTSD is, that can lead to that the person starts harming herself or himself, or like following ways of behavior that suits the attitude of the abuser. And maybe a little example where I just experienced myself something with my father. Where there was a moment where it was not actually that threatening or something, but I remember that like later on, what some shift that happened where I told him something, I responded to some question he repeatedly used to ask when he was drunk, and in a sense it was kind of not so serious, but I start telling him in a way something that he wants to hear. He might feel, oh, come on, practically fuck off, I was thinking, but like externally, I did something else. I tried to appease. So this is something where we can see that there's like quite a dynamic. So depending how the power imbalance is like that, yeah, we adopt behaviors that are actually not us. And that can at the end be even up to that we're very paralyzed. We lose ourselves and feel I'm stuck in there and I just have to be conformed with whatever the abuser wants.
Yeah. And it often will come to the place where the victim will justify on behalf of the abuser that they don't mean it, or they're really a nice person because they're so embarrassed publicly if things like that are known in public, or he embarrasses them in public. You know, the lovely surrendered wife will just, you know, try to justify and excuse for the sake of saving face. It's really hard to watch if you know that this poor woman is at home, perhaps being starved, abused, beaten, all kinds of things, you know. So it's really hard.
And it's very interesting, Keshava Madhava, you mentioned that, you know, when you've been in that in abusive situation, you adopt certain attitudes of the abuser. And that particular point that Rambhoru Prabhu covered earlier, that, you know, often these people that abuse others have been in similar situations and have childhood or other traumas. So it almost kind of traps one in that cyclical situation where the victim kind of, you know, kind of adopts that abuser mentality, and then they find somebody probably elsewhere, not within the same situation, that they feel that they can have some sort of upper hand almost. So it kind of traps a lot. It has the potential to trap a lot of people in this cyclical abusive situations, you know, as a result of people really, you know, adopting somebody else's values and not being able to essentially live their true selves. And based on that particular point, I just wanted to very quickly touch upon the impact this could have on, you know, that somebody neglecting their identity, essentially what impact it could have on people's ability to take part in you know, as a healthy individual in the society, and also what impact it could have on one being able to practice bhakti yoga, for instance. So if I wanted to go to maybe Keshava Madhava Prabhu first and then Rambhoru Prabhu.
Well, the impact it could have in regards to how someone is able to practice Bhakti yoga. Of course, the tendency is to adopt certain ideas, like the idea of humility and other certain values, in a way that is not healthy. But since it is then glorified and being seen as a virtue, you even do something which is not good for you, and ironically, or let's say sadly, you being praised for it. You know, you're such a nice, humble person, but at the end, you're maybe completely in self-denial. You don't even know who you are. You're not connected. And the so-called bhakti is maybe sometimes very much fear-driven. I have to be, you know, like this, so that otherwise I'm in danger, you know. So it also sets people up for exploitation, of course, particularly if there's authority structures where like behavior like this is being rewarded, you know, if you simply give yourself to it, even if you're being exploited, even if it's not viewed as exploitation necessarily, that's something the ironical thing. So, and there's a tendency to confuse. Dear Govinda Prabhu said it sometimes, to confuse ignorance with transcendence.
Yeah, true, right.
Rambhoru Prabhu, did you want to add?
Just that, you know, bhakti yoga is really a practice to know one's self. That's the whole goal, is that we want to realize or actualize our true self. And so, you know, as we chant and hear and worship and pray and do all those practices, the hope is that we start to reflect on who we really are and get in touch with our authentic self and experience ourselves in connection with the source of our life, who is in our hearts as well, the symptom of which should be some wisdom and joy. Satchidananda, that's who we are. And one may really question, gosh, if I'm pretending to do those things and not really taking shelter of the holy name and really practicing in a sincere way, then there's going to be a disconnect between what one professes to believe and one's experience of the practice. You know, like, gosh, it's interesting. I'm performing sacrifices, I'm chanting, I'm getting up early, I'm doing all these things, but underneath I'm feeling a lot of hostility. You know, I'm not feeling love, I'm feeling anger. And so again, when you have these unexpressed and repressed emotions, they come out sideways in illness, mental and physical illnesses like depression, suicidal ideations, and all kinds of disorders. Dis-ease, you're not feeling the Vaikuntha, the place free from anxiety. You're feeling a lot of anxiety. And yet, that if you want to get the love that you seek, that you have to behave in a certain way to earn it because of the social pressure. That if you're, fake it till you make it, the hope that at least if I can physically act out what it looks like to be a pure devotee, maybe people will be fooled by that and give me the love that I'm yearning for. Of course, it will not nourish your heart because that's not who you really are. You're a fallible human being who's making incremental slow steps towards Krishna. We can't jump over like a monkey. We just have to be who we are. So in order to be who you are, you better know who you are too. And Prabhupada said, first become conscious, then become Krishna conscious. So we can't miss that step. And what does it mean to be conscious? It means to be aware of oneself and one's impact on others, and to know what one's feelings are and what one's needs are. And we have to start there. Even in Bhagavad Gita, it talks about how, if we want to know Krishna, first we must understand the workings of the material world. So if you don't understand how the material energy works, there's no hope of transcending it. So you really have to just be aware that you can't hide. There's a witness inside of you, and every particle, and every air particle, dust particle, Krishna is witnessing. And to that degree, we are truly reaching out. To that degree, we will get knowledge. The curtain of illusion goes up. Can't fake
Thank you,
it.
Prabhu. Thank you. Two very important points. One being that, one point Keshava Madhava mentioned that, we can then put ourselves in certain situation by trying to be overly humble and kind of expose ourselves, into more forms of abuse essentially, and different sort of power struggles and exploitation, most importantly. And the very important point that Rambhoru Prabhu just made, that, Krishna consciousness is all about self-awareness, being conscious, and you putting that facade on would prevent you from doing that. So if you can't, realize oneself, then it would hinder you from moving forward in your spiritual life. Thank you ever so much. Sharadia, did you want to move us on to the next section of our conversation?
Yes, while I was listening, what struck me is that in this situation where you have to transform your identity, to kind of reconcile, why you are staying in this abusive situation. It sounds like there's also this phenomenon of gaslighting, but you're gaslighting yourself. Gaslighting meaning that you are denying reality. So in this situation, you're denying that you are suffering. You're denying that you cannot actually just transcend the situation. You are denying your level of Krishna consciousness, your level of of existence, basically. So I'm curious if you could share with us, how can people prevent themselves from gaslighting themselves when they're in abusive situations? And also, if they come to the point where they are happy to acknowledge or able to acknowledge that they're being abused, but then when they speak to others, then the other people gaslight them, how can they address that situation? So how do we deal with gaslighting, whether it's gaslighting ourselves or whether someone else is gaslighting us? When we share, we are experiencing abuse. So sorry, Rambhoru Prabhu, if you could respond first. Thank you.
I approach it through education, first of all. I mean, what I notice is that people, first of all, don't know what a feeling is, and in order to stop being gaslighted, or even resisting being gaslighted, one must know oneself well enough to know what I truly feel. That means getting in touch with the inner promptings that are authentically you. And so I have this course called Name Your Feelings, Tame Your Mind, where we go through all these emotions. And it's surprising to me how uneducated people are about the workings of their own feelings. Certainly in the English language, we don't even have a feeling word after the words I feel. And so we're kind of illiterate about feelings, just sad. People have the notion, I know we met in another podcast last year about grief. We were talking about grief. And people have this idea that grief is just sadness, but it's so much more, and loss. And underneath trauma is also loss in terms of loss of trust, loss of self, loss of identity. So it's just the first step is helping people learn to discriminate at least 6 basic feelings: sad, mad, glad, afraid, surprised, disgust. But there's like whole nuanced feelings. And what are the messages those feelings are communicating to you? There's a healthy message and there's a toxic message with anxiety. I mean, anxiety is part of life. And if you don't have a little bit of anxiety, you probably won't go to work and make money to pay your rent because you're afraid somebody will take your rent and your house away, right? So you have some anxiety that gets you going, gets you up in the morning. But then when anxiety becomes to the other degree where it's toxic, you're ruminating, you're full of fear, and people don't know how to read it. They just lump it all together. So I start with that, first of all, if someone is telling you what you think or don't think or feel or don't feel, if you don't know what you're really feeling or what your motives are, then how are you going to be able to resist someone telling you that something's telling you how you feel? And it's also a little bit challenging when you're working with an abuser, because if you don't know how to use I language and take ownership of your feelings by naming them, then you're going to just get caught up in blaming, and now the fighting gets escalated. So learning how to take ownership of, I know what I feel, and I disagree with what you have shared. And it's okay if we disagree, but I know myself well enough to know that was not my motive. And I need you to know it really hurts when you use words like that. And it's not helpful, to be able to take ownership and not, instead of blaming, but to take ownership. Well, this is how I'm affected or impacted by your behavior, and not play the same control game that the abuser is playing. But it starts with knowing yourself, because then you can't be fooled. You have to learn how to follow your heart. And then you need to know what the heart's telling you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think a very essential point that you made is it starts with creating awareness and empowering people to understand their feelings, to understand their needs, and also how to communicate that to others. Because as you rightly pointed out, if you don't have that knowledge, that self-knowledge, that emotional skills, then you won't be able to actually know when you're being gaslighted or when you gaslight yourself. So I think that's a very important point. Keshava Madhava, Prabhu, is there any further insights that you've got, any experiences that you have working with clients that you can share with us?
Well, yes, awareness raising is certainly at the beginning, because the unawareness is the breeding ground also for many unhealthy patterns that can then continue to exist. In the transformative communication courses that I teach, or like when I have clients in either therapy sessions or coaching sessions, what we use a lot, or like very consciously and abundantly, is the reflective listening. That I become someone who mirrors back to you what comes from you in terms of statements, in terms of feelings, so that you become aware how are you being perceived, because the feedback is not necessarily there in daily life, and for people sometimes also strange if someone reflects you. Why are you? What? But if it's accurate, if you can really perceive someone's feeling or someone's way of thinking and mirror it back effectively, this people will gain a lot of insight and becoming aware, and might be surprised. Oh yes, now when you said it, it's true, and then they will continue to explore themselves. And this is a very important step to help people see themselves. And there's a lot of methodology. There's a lot about communication. And ideally, if you have a course or like someone in a therapy session, then you have someone who already seeks help or has an interest in seeking help. On the other hand, if you have someone and this person is in an abusive situation and is not there, like, for example, very much rationalizing what the abuser is doing, being in defending, that might be a different story. Then it's also about a certain type of feedback you might want to give, but one has to be careful to assess what is my relationship with the person in terms of trust. How much is this person trusting that what I say has merit or is valuable or for my benefit? Because it can come across he or she attacks my only thing I have.
Right.
And so that requires a bit of more, now say, diplomacy or like strategy that you might have to seek some counsel from someone.
True. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rambhoru. I think what you both highlighted is the importance of self-awareness and, you know, developing our emotional intelligence, also if developing our relationship intelligence. I have a related question. So on the one hand, we've got gaslighting where there's denial, you know, of the situation of abuse. On the other hand, we can also have people who have a strong victim mentality and they're not really a victim, but they always see themselves as the victim. So what is the difference between a relationship which is abusive and a relationship that might just be dysfunctional, in a relationship that might just be disintegrating? And how can we differentiate? Because I think that's also problematic, where we've got people, you know, claiming to be the victim and really taking on that persona, where this in reality, you know, they're equally contributing maybe to a relationship that's just not healthy.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a wonderful book, probably Keshava, you know this book, called The Empowerment Dynamic by David Emerald. And he has this triangle of, you have the drama, Cartman's drama triangle, where you have the victim, a persecutor, and the rescuer. And typically a victim will seek somebody to rescue them, you know, and so they're kind of feeding on each other. But how you take that toxic triangle and move it to the healthy dynamic is when a person is a victim, and your natural tendency is to want to respond as the rescuer because they're so needy, looking for somebody to rescue them, or blame somebody as the persecutor. And we all play those roles at one time or the other. The healthy response is to become their coach, not the rescuer. And so you, instead of being sucked into it, the way to help them is to explore with them and help them find the resources with themselves and their empowerment to solve their own problem. And in fact, if you try to do someone else's work for them in terms of rescuing, that's enabling them, it's not helping them. So of course, what rescuing means is to help somebody who could do their own, do their job themselves. Obviously, if somebody is disabled mentally or physically, or can't do something for themselves, it would be an act of compassion. But if you see someone who's asking you or begging you or manipulating you to do things they can't do themselves, then you're enabling and you're rescuing them, which isn't healthy. So being aware of these three dynamics when I'm being the persecutor, very often people will see you, oh, you did it to me, the victim saying the persecutor. But for a victim in a victim's role to become healthy, they need to start interpreting or telling the story about the perceived persecutor as this is my challenge. This is just a challenge that I'm having right now. And I'm going to rise to that challenge by empowering myself, not to be a crybaby, but to step up and see what can I do to respond and make lemonade out of lemons. So, you know, we all play these roles from time to time as conditioned souls. And it's just really helpful to be aware when we're the victim or when we're trying to rescue people, like, why am I so quick to solve someone else's problem, when in fact that's disempowering for me to jump in there and try and fix. It's much more empowering to help that person find their own solutions. And then they walk out feeling empowered and instead of disempowered because you've done it for them. So it just, that's the way I teach at least our students. How do you get out of this thing? It's so rampant in interpersonal relationships. Victim, persecutor, and rescuer. We're always doing one of them.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think what stood out to me is that sometimes we think if we're in a relationship and we want to serve the other person, it means we should always be taking action on their behalf, always doing things for them. But what you highlighted is that we should consider long term what is most beneficial for them and what is most beneficial for me. And that might be, taking a step back and supporting them, but allowing them to do the work, allowing them to take the action. Keshava Madhava Prabhu, is there anything you can add for us to further understand the difference between actually being a victim of abuse and someone that's just internalized the victim mentality, and how, as a listener, can we differentiate between the two?
Yes, I'm thinking now in context of being in a helper role, first of all, and seeing also people who have, let's say, experienced rather intense abuse. Of course, there ranges, there are degrees of everything. And before you mentioned, Charlie, the distinction between dysfunctional relationship and abusive relationship. So distinctions, of course, require definitions. If someone has a victim mentality, I would assume that it was a genuine victimization at some point. And these kind of things, they mix. And I think one must be careful to not jump to a conclusion prematurely in regards to, am I now like dealing with someone who is being a victim, using, so to say, the victim role? And this might pass on a certain judgment that might cause quite some resistance, or like might damage the kind of helping relationship significantly. So I think both need to be acknowledged. If there is a genuine victimization, to pick that up, to empathically deal with that, to be there, and from there lead, as Rambhoru also nicely explained, you have to lead the person to the understanding, I have part in what's happening right now. I make choices. I may, for example, also trigger the abuser, because we have to see both sides. I mean, the abuser is one thing, but he's not, or he or she, because it can also be a she, can also be an abuser, but they have their ways of acting also in response to the victim's behavior. We have on one side, of course, we have the aggression from the abuser, but then we also have sometimes unseen or not so conscious aggression or counter-aggression from the victim, and where there's like mutual triggering. And to also see where do I participate, for example, that a conflict extends where it wouldn't have to, or, other ways, where perhaps provoke things out of whatever reason. So to see like, yeah, the responsibility part is important, to acknowledge when do I, for example, do not take responsibility and blame things on others, or like what was mentioned, the rescuing, that I just want to have someone pick me up, and do the work for me. And the other thing is to generally be there for someone, also support and acknowledge, hey, yeah, here you have been powerless, here you have been a victim, and it was not in your power to do something, because it happens. If there's like, there were so many examples at the beginning, there are situations where we are powerless. As a child, you're exposed to your parents, you're dependent. So you cannot expect like, hey, I should have stood up and I should have, leave me alive. It's not possible. Or like for a mother with children, I mean, it's easy to say and to give advice, sometimes quite bad advice. And the other thing is to help someone manage a situation. So I guess I'm stop here. I don't know if this was helpful.
Thank you. No, I think it was very helpful, because I think one very important point that you mentioned is, if we think that someone has a victim mentality, we should acknowledge that then they probably have experienced victimization at some point in time. And maybe it's not right now, but they've internalized that identity, that we mentioned earlier, that does happen. So I think that's a very important point. And I think another very valuable point that you raised is that whether someone is abused or whether someone has experienced abuse and now just feel like a victim, we have to help them to come to a point where they can take responsibility, not for being the cause of the situation, but for taking steps to get into a better situation, moving themselves out. So I think it's like, we understand that we are not responsible for what's happening to us, but at the same time, we are paying for what's happening to us, and we continue to pay, till the point where we are ready to take responsibility for moving ourselves out of the situation. So I think that was a very valuable point.
Okay, so I think Shraddha was mentioning that we are going to move on the conversation to the long-term impacts that abuse could have on victims and individuals. And we did briefly touch upon the idea of how this could cause trauma. So not just the impact on one's identity, but actually the physical and psychological impact on victims. So Keshava Madhava, I know you work in the clinical field. So two words that we always hear constantly is post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So can you just explain the characteristics and symptoms, because we also spoke about being that helper and the counselor. So how can one identify, what symptoms and characteristics would an individual display if they're going through these traumas, so that we can then identify that and get that person the support? So if you could maybe perhaps talk about what post-traumatic stress disorder would look like, and then what complex post-traumatic disorder would look like. That'll be really helpful.
Okay, I will give my best to share my understanding, because in fact diagnostics are of course done by psychiatrists, psychotherapists. There's a whole manual, for example, the DSM. I don't recall the full word, but it's a statistic manual of like where you assess when is what disease truly there. Like there are guidelines, there's a number of symptoms, there's a certain time period in which the symptoms have to occur, and so on and so on. And there are tests that are being made to assess whether it's truly like a post-traumatic stress disorder. And for the distinction, the post-traumatic stress disorder, let's say in German it's the einfache, the simple one, means that it was one particular event that had a traumatizing effect on the person. Whereas the complex post-traumatic stress disorder means there's either ongoing experiences that like either trigger already existing traumas or create new ones, or where there have been also several, maybe separate incidences that have been traumatic to the person. It might be several abusers or several incidents in a war situation or whatever, So complex means there are more incidents that perhaps are even ongoing till today, whereas the other is like there was once an incident that you still carry with you. So there are the definitions. What is a trauma in a psychiatric sense? The word trauma is also used a bit like other words in due course of time. They're used a bit more general and a bit sometimes perhaps even random. That's a bit of an issue sometimes, because in order to get a PTSD diagnosis, there has to be experiences, for example, of extreme disempowerment. You have been really helplessly exposed to. There can also be a natural power. You have been in an earthquake and so on. There can be you have been in family dynamics where you have been completely exposed, or like rape victims and so on, like where there was helplessness. Also, the experience of almost having to die, for example, that this is something where your whole self, so to say, and your trust in that life is safe is completely shaken. That you had an experience that completely rips apart your understanding of that the world is a place where I can exist safely. So of course there might be different levels to all that. And symptoms are, for example, like we had this, I want to use that now, the screen of Shraddha was frozen. So we can also see that in the mind of people, certain parts of us, they literally freeze in. And in trauma therapy also, this is the ego state therapy that we talked shortly about up front, that we understand there are parts in ourselves that are related to the, for example, traumatic event, and they're kind of frozen in there. This term is used. Sometimes you can also say paralyzed, and people might also experience sometimes in their daily life this kind of states of just freezing in. They're just kind of paralyzed. And there's also so-called dissociative symptoms that they're not necessarily always visible. If you pay attention, you might see, but it's a lot of an internal process. It's not like that it's completely like obvious for everyone, but if people fully disconnect from what's happening right now, that they even might have so-called blackouts where they feel like, I don't remember what was going on the last hour or two, or find themselves, I entered here the train, and I just, the last thing I recall, I'm at home, or like that they lose time. This could be, or sometimes in situations that they're shortly really disconnect, and it's a defense mechanism of the mind to protect yourself from certain painful emotions that you can't handle, and then rather disconnect completely than having to be overwhelmed by these feelings. And another maybe important thing that could be rather visible for people is hyper-arousal. They call it that you're in a high state of alert. There's always a sense of danger, and you're very quickly being triggered and become perhaps defensive and agitated or nervous. So there could be there are some indicators that it might be traumatization. But in terms of really assigning PTSD to someone, that's part of the psychotherapists, psychiatrists. We can have our guesses and ideas, but I guess it's very important not to diagnose people based on, let's say, also would be layman understanding. So because there's more to it, and people can also easily identify, there's also another thing perhaps, but just to shortly mention, with diagnosis in a very unhealthy way. It becomes a form of identity, and that's really not helpful.
No, thank you. That was very, very helpful, Prabhu, because, and the question wasn't direct. We're not encouraging anybody to be going around diagnosing people, but I think it's important, to understand what symptoms may somebody kind of show, so that we can be compassionate towards them and not be judgmental. Like you mentioned something about being hyper aroused. If somebody's always panicking or, very, very sensitive to everything, then we can, as devotees, when interacting or in our everyday life, we can say, okay, that person clearly has something that's happened to them that triggers this kind of behavior, so that we can be at least compassionate toward them. There's another point or condition that we get mentioned that I wanted to pick up, but before we do that, Rambhoru Prabhu, did you have anything to add to that around what symptoms people may display if they're going through some sort of trauma?
Well, just as Keshava was describing, different behaviors, like feeling, how do you say, not integrating in a group, maybe being standoffish, maybe not being very vocal, maybe isolating, but also being very guarded and speaking in global language. That's something we connect with when, as chaplains who are busy doing a lot of listening, but assessing that when you're asking about a person's story, very often they will talk all around the story and not really, there's not the ability to really share. So they're editing out everything that is painful to talk about, and you can't really get a sense of who they are. So that's kind of, for me, a indicator a little bit. There's something going on that they're trying really hard to avoid talking about, because they don't want you to know, they don't trust you, maybe it's too painful, they've lost the ability to talk about it. Or you might remind them of the abuser. I've had that happen as a supervisor of chaplains, where one of my students, they ran away from home when they were 16 because they had their stepmother was an abuser and stuff. And somehow or other, I reminded them of that. And so that can be a trigger for people. And they may not even be conscious that there's certain personalities. Temple presidents remind them of the mean dad. We've just had some cases here in that way, and people don't make that connection. But if you don't know the history and you see the behavior in your office while you're talking to somebody, that would be an area to explore with them. How is what's happening to you right now similar to a previous experience? Where else have you felt as mistrustful or triggered? Where else? And usually it's not anything about what's happening with them now. It's something that happened way back, perhaps in their early life, that they've forgotten. And if you take them back there, they are likely to remember, oh my God, yeah. And then now you're hearing the real story. It's not anything about their authority issues. It's really about mom and dad. So that's really helpful.
No, thank you, Rambhoru. And I think it's also important when you said, some people are quite guarded, or, they talk in global language or talk globally. I think when we kind of see that sort of behavior, it's important to understand that and acknowledge it, but also try not to probe too much, because obviously they're doing that for a reason, not to visit, trauma that they're still obviously, having to process or haven't quite processed yet. So I think it's very important not to go into over helper mode, but build that trust and relationship
Exactly.
with somebody gradually, rather than, because I think that could be very traumatic, even with the best of intentions, trying to probe and understand why you're doing this, talk to me, I think it could be worse, really, unintended consequences. I think,
Just put a point in your brain. Just notice that this person doesn't feel safe with you, and just spend time building rapport and relationship till they're ready.
Yes, he would like to jump in, because since you mentioned it, yes, often like some attitude is, you have to talk about it, or we have to talk about it. No, you don't have to talk about it. That's very important, because that can be even re-traumatizing if you have truly someone who is a victim of trauma, because it's again someone enforcing one's own way on a person.
Yeah.
So that would be a very destructive way of helping. That's the opposite of helping. Yeah.
Freedom. Yeah, giving people the full freedom to make their choices is the least traumatizing for them. So.
Thank you. One other thing I wanted to very quickly cover with you, particularly Keshava Madhava, this might be very up your street, given that you work in the clinical field. But, we also hear something called post-traumatic demoralization syndrome. Can you touch on this very briefly? And the symptoms of this, and what this is really?
I must admit, this term is new to me.
Oh,
I haven't heard of that.
I've never heard it either. Do you want to tell us what you know about it? Because you obviously know about it.
My understanding is it's where you kind of get stuck in situations because of trauma. You get into a situation where you demoralize. It's a little bit like, I think, if you interpret it as is, around you kind of playing victim all the time, and you demoralize yourself. So there's some sort of trauma that you haven't quite processed, and then you kind of get that, sort of your identity then becomes more, your kind of entire worldview becomes quite demoralized. You see people, this happened to me, that happened to me, so they have no drive, and they're more demoralized as opposed to empowered individuals, is my take on it. But I don't know, Sharadia, did you have any other takes? I've seen this crop up, but did you have any other takes on this?
I think it links probably to what we discussed earlier about, victims internalizing their behavior and the identity and the status that the abuser has given them. So even though the abuse has stopped, I think someone might in the long term feel that they are worthless, feel that they are, that they are weak, feel that they cannot make good decisions. Because I think that's something I've often seen with victims, is that they feel that they cannot think for themselves. They feel that, they are unequipped basically to deal with life, and to be what Prabhupada actually wanted us to be, independently thoughtful, devotees. So I think that is what I assume it means, but it's clearly a term that might be newer, and we still need to explore further. But it does seem to be a valuable term, to use to describe victims' experiences.
No, thank you. And Shraddha, did you want to move us on to, so we've spoken a little bit about, types, symptoms of abuse, different types of abuse, and what impact it may have on individuals. And I think we are going into touching upon how we can actually deal with these situations. We touched upon it very briefly earlier when we covered about dealing with these situations. So Shraddha, did you want to move us on to the next section?
Yeah, so we want to start discussing what victims firstly can do for themselves when they are experiencing abuse. I think this is a challenging question, because of course, no one exists in isolation. We're always part of a community. We're part of a certain social setting. But what steps should someone take if they realize I am experiencing abuse? Also taking into consideration, as Rambhoru pointed out, that if you are being abused, you might actually be in a dangerous situation. So what are good steps for someone to take?
Yeah, that's the obvious easy answer is to find a place where you can feel safe. And that may not be easy to come by if you now have to disclose to your, if you're say in a Hare Krishna community and there's a taboo against, you know, a woman leaving her husband because, you know, it's disgraceful. And after all, the woman is responsible for the marriage working out. It's hard. Who do you talk to? You know, maybe you have to go outside the institution to a local hotline. You know, there's national hotlines for domestic abuse and speak to a specialist. They are expert in that kind of thing. You know, when you have somebody who is isolated, they don't know who to go to because all their friends they don't want to know. And they are expert at figuring out if you have to just be picked up at the corner and taken to a shelter where nobody knows. I mean, they go to great lengths to protect women if they are truly abused. In the shelter there, those places are not known. Nobody knows where they are except for the people themselves so that the abuser can't find them while they're trying to reach safety. I know in North America in the last year or so, there has become a network of women who are, there's a point person in every temple where if you are experiencing abuse, you can call and they will have the resources in their local community where, you know, some help for you if there's nobody in your community. Ideally, it would be that you had some ladies who would give shelter to someone and protect them. But you know, what are you doing to restrain an abuser if they are physically violent? That's very tricky. Maybe alert the police also, that maybe you have to bring in legal people for help. Yeah.
I think what comes out, especially if the situation, you know, is actually a dangerous one, that is that although it might be very challenging for someone, is that they have to, in some way or the other, stay level-headed and work on a plan. Because I think what it becomes clear is you can't just, you know, you can't just make an erratic action because that can be even more dangerous. You have to have a plan of who you're going to speak to, where you're going to go, and ensuring that there is a safe place for you where you can stay and you can receive, you know, the ongoing long-term support that you need. Because what you're pointing out, it's not as you know, it's like it seems like the easy solution is just go somewhere, but in reality, just going somewhere might actually be quite complex. It might not be as
if there's children
straightforward.
involved. Yeah, if you have children, it's really, really hard.
Keshava Madhava, do you have anything further you want to add?
Well, yeah, what was mentioned already is it's an option to first of all get informed. Where could I go? Particularly more like the public, how to say, from side of the government, facilities, establishments that are there to help victims of abuse. If you talk about like within a Krishna conscious community, yes, it's tricky in regards because you don't know what response will you get necessarily, depending how sensitive leadership is toward this whole issue. First of all, what is the kind of maybe also prejudices about things, and yeah, if you become aware, like, okay, I'm abused. Also, the question is like, what could be what person do I trust most that I know who could be of help for me to first of all address that? And if we talk about safe space, we can also talk about a person that they can, we say in English, confide in, or like to be someone, person of trust. But this is also a safe space, you know, that it should not be underestimated. This is of high value if you have at least one person that where you can present your situation, and from there see what measures will you take. Because maybe something I want to shortly mention here is like, if you talk of abusive relationships, a systematic approach, like how systemic approach is, that we see not just so separately abuser, victim, and people, but we see it as a system in which different parts functioning in their own dynamic. So, and each part has an influence in it, and that we understand like, okay, it's not cannot necessarily be separated. Okay, here's the abuser, that's the issue, and this is where we evolve around. It's a system. We talked about also about enabling abuse. We talked about different things, but also it's about the own responsibility. How do I, perhaps knowingly or unknowingly, participate, or how to say, unnecessarily facilitate abusive situations?
Thank you so much, Prabha. I really like the point that you said, like, find one safe person, because I think if you are being abused, having to think about, the whole strategy to get out of the situation might be very overwhelming. But if you can find that one person that you really trust, will hear you and help you, I think that could be a very, good practical first step. Something else which you mentioned, which I do think, is very important to discuss, both of you touched upon the challenge that we have within the devotee community, or the ISKCON community, of not feeling that we can speak out about abuse, because we will, experience criticism, or if, it's a lady, she will be blamed for the situation not working out. Now, you mentioned that we have to, if we are experiencing abuse, we have to acknowledge if we are responsible in enabling the abuse. But what is the difference between enabling the abuse and being told that you are the cause for the abuse? Because I've often heard, ladies being told that it's your fault that you are being abused. It's, as Rambhoru Prabhu pointed out, it's your fault that the relationship or the marriage isn't working. So what is the difference between those two?
Well, I will just give a little backstory. Many years ago, probably 40 years ago, when I was living in Vrindavan, I thought it would be nice to write a book about grihastas, which I'm glad I didn't write. But I went around and I interviewed a whole lot of men to find out what is the thing that bugs them the most about women. What do they find the hardest thing to tolerate? And they all said almost unanimously, I can tolerate an ugly wife. I can tolerate a wife who can't cook or whatever. She may be crazy, but what I can't tolerate is if she's criticizing. So I thought that was very telling, and it may well be that, women in close relationships, they over-identify with their husbands and who are representing them, and they start pecking away. And so finally the husband gets fed up with it. And he gives her a whack. But in my view, I don't care how misbehaved your wife is. It is never, ever a reason for physical violence or gaslighting or something. You better leave the room before you start throwing things or hitting someone, because you just can't justify, well, I beat my wife up because she bugged me. That is not going to fly illegally or even ethically or even in Krishna consciousness. In fact, if you are the husband and you're the leader, supposed to be the representative of Guru, we have this wonderful instruction by Srila Prabhupada, who gave this instruction to GBC and all our leaders, is that if you make them love you, they will do anything that you want. And to me, that's the real rule. Don't expect the women who are supposed to be 9 times more lusty and less intelligent and all those things. And after all, they're innocent because they're just have the mental maturity of a 12-year-old. Well, then, okay, then you, as the leader, have to be smart enough to make us love you enough to want to do all those things that you want us to do, not by force, but by love. And if you think of bhakti as being a movement about love and unconditional love, as soon as there's force and control, there's no love there. You just can't put a gun to someone's head and demand, wife, just because you're married, the entitlement, this notion that now I'm the husband and I'm entitled that you should worship me and love me. I don't feel love if I'm forced. You got to inspire me. And so that's the job. In my view, that's the antidote, is that, all right, you're a leader, you want to be in charge, you need to inspire me to love you enough to do all that stuff and do it willingly. voluntarily, not by force.
Thank you so much, Rambhoru. I think what you did mention is that, say, if a woman need to take responsibility for their part, they should be conscious, maybe not to nag, incessantly. At the same time, men need to take responsibility on their part, and when they do feel agitated, deal with it in a way that's not harmful and destructive. They can acknowledge if they feel frustrated or irritated, but that does not justify abusing them. I'm conscious that there was a senior devotee recently in Australia apparently saying, that publicly, that when, women nag, they are the cause of abuse. I think it's very important that we do, address this from a more knowledgeable point of view. Keshava Madhava Prabhu, sorry to put you on the spot, but as a man, do you have any other perspective? I'm just conscious, we all in, female bodies, we might experience this differently. Is there something you could add to enlighten us further?
Yeah. I mean, I know if I can enlighten you, but I really very much appreciated the point Rambhoru Mataji was bringing when she did the survey with the people, and there are sensitivities in both, in men and women, in their psyche, in our egos. We have that. And I think the way to a healthy, constructive togetherness is that we are aware and conscious, that we are conscious of that, and find ways to how to say, in a constructive way, handle that. If I know, for example, if it would be, I'm the man, when I'm sensitive about being criticized, perhaps excessively, to be aware, okay, here's a vulnerable spot. And of course, if I pick on that spot, of course it hurts. And what do people do when they are hurt? Independent of men or women, they tend to hurt back. So I find often that, but violence, in a sense, we talk about, let's call it, it's an attempt of communication, like it comes after if the attempt of communication are gone completely wrong, or not, we're completely ineffective. So it's a helpless way often of communicating. We can call it like that. It's not an acceptable way. I don't say that at all. But it sometimes comes out of helplessness. Sometimes it might be malice. Sometimes there might be different motivations. Why does a person become aggressive and violent? Because also maybe as women, you have experience. Women also let's say with children. Women have maybe another challenge when the children talk back, and being sometimes very insulting. I notice sometimes things children say to their mother, and they feel like, oh my God, and the woman lashes out because it's just too much. It just hurts you too much. So we can understand violence. We shouldn't separate verbal violence, not too much, from physical violence. Of course, they're two different things, but they have, they can have a causal relationship. If you say, this leader in Australia, he said, okay, if a wife is nagging and therefore is the cause of the violence, I would say the statement is inaccurate, because the accurate statement might be, okay, the nagging might be a cause of hurt. The response to that hurt, if he says he wants to beat up, that's his responsibility. So his choice to responding to the hurt he experiences from the nagging, that's that. So we have to find this very important part in the middle is missing there. And men and women, they hurt each other also in so many ways, also subtly. And men have sensitive egos, even if they don't want to admit it, they sometimes have more sensitive egos than women, and therefore they need more this reassurance and more, perhaps even moderation. I don't expect it all. I mean, I don't feel kind of embarrassed to think, yeah, if my partner, my wife worship me and look at me, I think, my God, please don't. Let's have a level of very on how to say Augenhöhe on yeah. So I guess I got a bit into here and there. I don't know. Perhaps I give it back to you.
No, Prabhu, I think that was brilliant, because I think, sometimes as a woman, if you hear that statement, a woman nagging, is the cause of being abused. I mean, for me, when I hear that statement, I just feel very offended, and I'll just go to immediately, no, it's the man's fault. But I think what you did was so valuable, is that you pointed out, but the woman's words hurt the man's ego. So there is hurt, and she might be responsible for hurting his ego, but the man is responsible for then deciding to take that action and physically abusive. So I think you actually did us a great service in pointing out that both have a responsibility, and we have to see the connection between physical and verbal abuse, and that they can be connected. So I think that was very insightful. Thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, and there's loads of questions we'd still like to cover, but there are certain questions that are have been highlighted for the session. So I'd like Dee to move us to that section of the discussion.
Thank you, Sharadia. So the next section we want to cover around a little bit around the Shastras and what's mentioned and what's not. And I just wanted to cover around what does our Shastras say about abuse of women and protection of women. I mean, I recall, there's lots of verses in the Bhagavatam and particularly Bhagavad Gita, the idea of the need to protect, the women, the children, and the cows and the elderly, which most of us know. But what does our Shastras in particular say about abuse of women and protecting them? Rambhoru Prabhu, if I go to you first.
Well, I don't have a lot of Shastras rolling around in my head. I just know I focus on the essence, which to me is compassion, unconditional compassion of other living beings. If you're really looking at the essence of the Parampara message in terms of we're not the body, we're spiritual beings, and we do no harm. And what even to an ant, Krishna values an ant equal to a human being as spiritual beings. Then what to speak of a woman or a man, beating, verbally abusing, disrespecting? It just belies how lack of consciousness we have if we are starting to focus on externals, bodies and genders and ethnicities. So yeah, it's pretty specific that way, but Prabhupada also has thrown about all kinds of different things in our scripture that can be really confusing when you think of the essence is we're not the body, we're spiritual beings, and our duty is to serve God and have compassion for all living beings. So I have come to the conclusion that whatever it says, if you can derive an excuse to abuse verbally, emotionally, physically, financially others, then you have misunderstood the scripture. And now it classifies as religious abuse and spiritual abuse. You're taking the texts out of context, and now you're using them as weapons to punish people because maybe you don't feel good about yourself. So you're using scripture to justify your own misuse and abuse of power. It's not unique to the Hare Krishna movement. All religions have these ancient texts about women and men and dynamics. But in my view, it's really boiling down to the essence of our goal. What are we trying to do here? Always remember and never forget God and who we are as servants. And when you're a servant, whether you're a husband or wife in a marriage, it's meant to be a mutual relationship of serving one another and helping one another go back to Godhead and raise their own Krishna consciousness. As soon as you start talking abuse, you're not even in the ballpark of bhakti in some way. I mean, you're just out of the arena, because I think it's just misunderstood and misused philosophy.
Thank you, Rambhoru Prabhu. And I think when I read the GBC statement against domestic abuse, and I think it was very interesting, they classed something exactly what you mentioned called spiritual abuse is what they called it. It's essentially using the scriptures to put male or female, to put anybody down. And I think we always kind of mention this, if you really wanted to misapply the Shastras or misapply Prabhupada's teachings or what he said, you could always find a statement, from somewhere to justify anything you wanted, really.
Right.
I think you quite rightly mentioned, it's not unique to the Hare Krishnas. It's you see that in most religious contexts, and it's just the idea that, again, scriptures are there to guide us and the Shastras are there to guide us, but there's also the idea of Desha Kala Patra, time, place, circumstance. It's the ability to ascertain that and to apply that in an intelligent way that's most important. And Keshava Madhava Prabhu, is there anything you wanted to add on this? Maybe either your take take on how you apply certain maybe controversial things that people might use to use as defense of abusing women, or anything you wanted to touch on the idea of what's there in the Shastras around abuse and protection of women?
Yeah. I'm not so much concerned with any kind of statements that would support it, because for me, I will not touch on them, because for me personally, since I have my first-hand experience of violence, might be emotional abuse, physical abuse. For me, it's a no-go. For me, it's not a way I want to walk at all, and I wouldn't want to support anyone or like encourage anyone to go that way, because I see it's simply destructive. It doesn't lead to any kind of productive or uplifting result. On the contrary, it's just destructive. So I would like to approach it a bit from the perspective, let's see the three modes of nature, and there's a different shastra suggesting different things for different people, different modes. And what is maybe acceptable for a person in a certain mode of nature is not necessarily acceptable for someone in another mode of nature. So if you're concerned with cultivating sattva guna, which we are supposed to, then we must consider, is the acting out of physical violence or like emotional abuse, the insult and whatever, is this anywhere close to what we consider sattva? And I think anyone with a bit of ability of discrimination will come to the answer, no, it's not. Sattva is the maintaining principle, it's the balancing, it's the healthy way of doing things. So in transformative communication, what we also do is we highlight, okay, the ways of communication, let's aim for sattva, because that's something that nourishes, that's something that can heal. Words can harm, words can heal. But this depends on whether you are aware, like what does it take that your language can heal. And rajas and tamas, there we can attribute violence to it, language that is insulting, language that is harsh, overly criticizing and devaluing and so on. And then we're at the range of tamagun. So, and you must ask yourself, if you are Vaishnava, do you want to stay in rajas and tamas, or you want to be up to the requirement of sattva? And so I think anything that does not support sattva should not be even given the time. Yeah, space. Why? For what reason? So that would be my attitude on that.
You know, just to, as you were talking, I was realizing the word Vaishnava or Vishnu is the sustainer, the maintainer, right? And then you have Shiva's the energy of destruction and Brahma creation. But if we are truly Vaishnavas, then all the sattva guna is really there to help maintain the creation. So as soon as you move into destroying life or, death dealing or destruction, you're not even in the ballpark of sustaining Krishna's creation or movement or people. It's life-giving what we're doing, not death dealing. Yeah.
May I add a very short detail, because we talked about shastras and examples. The only thing that came to my mind right now, because before we also talked of children, is the story of Dhruva Maharaj and the stepmother Suniti, and how she, through her abusive words, harmed his ego very, very crucially, which led him to renounce his role there and go in the forest and wanting to have a greater kingdom than his father. So we can see the power of words, what they can use, also the insult. And we have, a good example there, I think, where we can all be conscious how our words are creating certain emotional, mental realities that will fall back on us in this way or another.
Thank you, Prabhu. That was really helpful. I think you both touched upon the idea, the mode in which, you kind of approach the Shastras. Do we want to approach in the mode of ignorance or passion, or in a more sattvic manner that we all need to aspire to? And also the point that Rambhoru Prabhu just mentioned around, it's all about helping maintain the creation as Vaishnavas. So if you're trying to find excuses or bits from the Shastra, or in misapplication, if it's actually not helping us sustain the creation, it's causing us imbalances and disharmony within society, then that's not a very positive thing to do. So thank you very much. That was very, very helpful. And Sharadya, you wanted to now move on to something that I briefly touched upon earlier around the kind of work GBC is looking to actively do to support abuse victims, and also to kind of bring awareness around the issue of domestic abuse, and to help devotees and communities within ISKCON around it. So Sharadya, would you like to move us on to that bit, please?
Yeah, so this is our last topic of discussion. And so as we've mentioned, the GBC did pass this resolution related to domestic abuse. Now, I wanted to ask a couple of questions related to that. So this resolution has been passed, as individuals, what perspective is it asking us to take on abuse? And as communities, what is it asking us to do to have strategies in place to deal with abuse? And as I would say, like a global society which has many, many different cultures, what is it asking us in terms of understanding abuse in diverse cultural contexts? Because one thing that I noticed in the resolution, it said that domestic abuse is a widespread issue, and it also said in some cultures it's normalized. In some cultures, it's not seen as abuse, but we have to acknowledge it is abuse. So it's a big topic, but what is this resolution given to us by the GBC asking us to do as individuals and as communities surrounding this issue? Maybe Rambhoru Prabhu, you could respond first.
Audio. Okay. So I think as you were talking there, I was thinking of Srila Prabhupada's instruction to us. I was there in Vrindavan when they were just building the Gurukul, and we were doing the Gurukul in the guest house. It was just an empty land. And I think we have to, as our Param Guru, or as our founding Acharya, we have to go back, whatever culture you are. It's not the issue. It's Prabhupada's culture, that he was giving us. And when we were in Vrindavan, there was still abuse going on in his presence. I mean, while he was on the planet. So this is not like now. It's always been an issue. So just look at the examples in our text. It's all playful and attraction and beautiful words. It's just not. We teach by example as well. Don't start talking about something. Show me what love is. Yeah. So that's just what I wanted to say about it.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think what you highlighted, what is very essential, is that whether it's our own family culture or whether it is, our ethnic culture or national culture, we should distinguish that between what Prabhupada taught us and the essence of Vaishnava culture. And I think we should also distinguish what Prabhupada taught, what Prabhupada showed us, and from what we might think we read in other scripture, because that's also, another I think mistake that devotees can make, is think that they can justify their behavior because they read something in some other shastra. So I think that is very important. And as you said, Prabhupada was focused on inspiring people, making people feel loved. And I think many times he said that there's no question of force, and that was for everyone. There's no question of force. So I think that was a very, very valuable response. Keshava Madhava, is there something you'd like to add? What you think is, the message that we're getting, the request that we're getting as individuals and as a society from the GBC making this official resolution?
I must confess I'm not fully aware of the message in this resolution. What stayed with me when you were reading that is kind of a bit like a bit of justification of okay, in India it's like this and therefore it's not so much abuse compared to Western countries. Did I get that correctly?
So the GBC, I can read a little bit for you. The GBC passed a whole resolution on or against domestic abuse, and it firstly it acknowledges that there is a widespread problem of domestic abuse, and then it goes on to say that in certain cultures, this behavior might have been normalized, but we have to acknowledge that it's still abuse. And then there's a section where it says what is the Vaishnava response to abuse, and that it is unacceptable in any situations. And then it also highlights that leaders have an obligation to help, and that the community also has that obligation to help. So that is in essence the main parts of the resolution.
I think one thing that is important, like also in my field of work, we talked before about diagnostics and stuff, that yes, definitions are important. What is abuse? What is it not? And to not also maybe every kind of how to say term or phenomena can be also used a bit randomly, or the kind of say can be overused for rather things that maybe not and otherwise would go in this category. So let's say someone says something that I don't like, I feel kind of a bit insulted, and I say I was abused. It goes quickly then to become in a dynamic of where no one dares to say anything anymore because it could be emotional abuse, for example. So I think it's important to have a guide and to be clear about, well, okay, when does it start? How do we define abuse as well? And that certainly is about if there is a violation of physical health and safety, or if there's like conscious and or like intentional harm or hurt, of a person out of either malice and whatever. So in cultural differences, yes, they might be there. I think what is important for leaders also to evaluate the ideas behind that, because there's a belief, obviously, with certain cultures maintain certain behaviors that they think there's benefit. There must be some understanding, some belief behind it, somehow that this is beneficial. There might be the belief, yes, with the stick, then people become more obedient and they learn something through that. And we said before, it's just an oppression. They might just like out of fear obey, but it doesn't mean they have developed internally some sense of whatever that's good, or that's, so the inspiration is important, that we must ask ourselves what is truly helpful, what is sattvic. And abuse, if we see it, it should not be normalized, though it is, unfortunately. On the contrary, there should be sensitivity, that we do not go along with that, because this one question is in my mind, was in the emails, where it said, what should the victim be told, what not be told? And I think certainly something a woman should not hear is, you have to tolerate. This was something told by leaders or gurus, and I think that's very destructive, because that's not just enabling the abuser, it's just outright wrong. You just agreeing, or like how to say, you're allowing something which is against the whole principle of Vaishnava culture, of sattva,
Thank you so much, Prabhu. So you highlighted something that leadership should not do. Leadership should not tell victims of abuse that you just need to tolerate, because that can be very detrimental to the individual and everyone involved. So for our closing question, I want to ask both of you, this GBC resolution states that leadership has a responsibility to help, address domestic abuse, which I find interesting because, ISKCON, if we look at the original purposes, it's a religious organization. It's it's supposed to re-spiritualize society, etc. It doesn't actually have in its original purposes, outlined, pastoral care as one of its functions. But now the GBC has highlighted that leaders have this responsibility. So what proactive steps do you think local leadership could take to not necessarily address, an abuse case when it arises, but to proactively have support or strategies in place to more effectively deal with it when it happens? Because inevitably, when you deal with people, there are going to be, these challenges, domestic abuse, whether it's, partner abuse, child abuse, etc. So maybe Keshava Madhava, you can tell us, what do you think would be, say for Zurich, where you are based, what would be, say 3 strategies that local leadership could have in place?
Well, so just on top of my head, like I don't know if I get 3 strategies, but something that's on my mind when you were speaking is that we have to start with being careful what we preach. If you get to hear this kind of things that were also mentioned by Rambhoru Mataji, that women are like this, and this kind of stereotypes, I would say, where it's questionable that is it even valid? Like it's certainly not. I mean, we can see so many facts about male and female that contradict such statements. So first of all, to not give space or too much space to such kind of ideas or cultural stereotypes that actually are not compatible with the society we live in. So because this creates this kind of tension, also conflict, where people get ideas, well, in the relationship, man role, women role, it has to be like this and this like that. And even we don't fit in, we try to squeeze ourselves into something we are not. And this creates that's already the form of violence, actually, to kind of try to impose a certain framework on someone the person doesn't fit in. I think that would be a big start to be a bit more sober and aware of what are the time, place, and circumstances, and what kind of cultural values and ideas do we want to highlight and to cultivate.
Yeah, nice.
Thank you, Prabhu. I think especially coming, from someone, a devotee in a male body, I think that's a very valuable message. And I do hope, that message, will spread to more communities, because I think that actually is the cause of, or a contributing cause to a lot of the, I would say, like, dysfunctional relationships that we see, abusive relationships that we see. And especially if someone already has a tendency, towards being controlling, towards being, overly dominant, and then they hear this in a class and they hear this repeatedly, I think they feel justified. They even feel encouraged, in their behavior. Rambhoru Prabhu, is there anything you would like to add? I know, of
Yeah.
course, a big contribution you're making is education. Do you think there's anything else that leadership in particular could do?
Yeah, I think there needs to be some kind of monitor on our Bhagavatam classes. People who give classes, there needs to be a team who's listening to them and making an assessment of the ethos that they're spreading. They need to have a corrective or even a guideline on, your spin on these texts. Especially when you read the text that householders are meant to be caring for the vulnerable populations, women, children, elders, and I would add to that the mentally and physically challenged people of our day. As we have it now in Kali Yuga, it's totally flipped. Women, children, they're the most abused and neglected elders, and just in the same way as you wouldn't now think you're going to beat up an elder or starve an elder or a baby. That goes across the whole spectrum of vulnerable people. That would include women as well as the vulnerable population. So I think that the temple president needs to have a team. If he can't watch all the classes, have a team of a couple of people who are screening them, and then training people before they give classes. You have your Bhakti Shastri training. That ethos can only change if you help people understand the essence of our teachings. Secondly, I think that people need to, like in the community I'm in, wonderful, wonderful community, but most people are really not very knowledgeable of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. They, we read the Gita and they read the Bhagavatam, and they may never get to the Chaitanya Charitamrita, which puts it all in perspective so much. What is the essence of our real mission? And it's so much off the bodily platform that it helps liberate us from all these, the ideal society and the Varnashram system, which is important to know, but it isn't the goal of the Hare Krishna movement to establish that. Prabhupada wanted it, but mainly because we couldn't do the whole thing. So I think that needs to be cultivated a little bit more. And I think the books that we have on Grihastha life need to be a little bit screened as well. There's some books circulating around and people fly in and they drop the bomb. People buy the books and now they go home and they beat their wives because they're not living up to, satisfying their needs. And that's your job because you're the woman in the Vedic society. You need to satisfy my needs. It's like, oh my God, there are some really good books for care of women and the responsibility in Grihastha life called, it's an old book done by Grihastha Vision Team that I would promote because it's a collection of different essays by different devotees, Krishna Nandini, but others who are themselves married, but also have degrees in behavioral sciences. It's very balanced, full of Shastra. I would say that's a very good book for people who are confused about all the things they're hearing. That would be one I would be lifting up for people to read, just for help. But I do think that somebody has to oversee it. And then if someone is being abused, there needs to be a committee, some kind of a team. I'm developing a little team here. I'm doing these intercourses. There are about 5 of women who are here taking. It is predominantly a women's thing, the devotee care thing. We have this natural tendency to want to care and nurture people. And they're quite excited about having strategies, what to do. So I think that, you know, having a team of people who are alert and tuned into the congregation, also communicating with them, having regular Vaishnava Sanghas where you can talk about what's on your heart today, and create a caring community where people who might be abused and not have anybody to talk to, they will naturally seek out friends that they've connected with on a regular basis in a community environment. Then they'll have a place to go. Some ideas.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think that was a good way to end our session. I think you've highlighted that we need to be proactive when it comes to supporting victims of abuse. And one of the ways which we can do that, as I think what essentially you're saying is we've got to have set standards, and we have to have kind of set rules when it comes to, you know, speaking about social dynamics and household dynamics. And we've got to have that, you know, so that when speakers speak, they know, you know, what is the bounds of what they can say and cannot say. And if they have their personal convictions, there is space for that, but they cannot be allowed to say that, you know, those things publicly, if it can potentially be detrimental. And I think another important point, I think it would be so valuable if this could be official GBC policy. So I think that if you're not a knowledgeable person, if you're not trained in abuse, you should not be speaking elaborately on abuse, because I think that is, you know, a point where we've gone seriously wrong, you know, in the past. People who don't have a training in psychology, in social work, and then speaking, you know, on these topics as experts, and then because of their position within ISKCON, they are taken, you know, very seriously. And this might just really not be an area of the expertise where they can really, you know, guide people, you know, in a way that is healthy and beneficial. So thank you both so much for giving your very, very precious time. I think it was been a very insightful conversation. I've definitely learned a great deal myself, and I do hope that all the devotees viewing the discussion will also feel that they've learned. And please also note that if you are interested in any of the courses that was mentioned by Rambhoru Prabhu, you can find them at Karuna Care. There's many courses, they're ongoing, different times, all of them are online. So that's a wonderful resource that I think that many devotee communities should access. So Dee, would you like to say any closing words?
Thank you, Sharadi, and just like to thank ISKCON Vaishnavi Ministry for giving us the opportunity to carry out this discussion and for taking the time to actually discuss this very important issue. And sometimes these sort of somewhat tricky issues can be swept under the carpet because they are difficult issues to discuss, and also for them to, you know, a big thank you to them for choosing such eloquent and qualified speakers in the form of Rambhoru Prabhu and Keshava Madhava Prabhu. And I honestly can think of very few other people who could speak on this topic with the authority and the expertise that they just spoke. And like Shraddha, I found this conversation immensely helpful. So thank you everybody for joining us, and for Rambhoru Prabhu and Keshava Madhava Prabhu for very generously giving up your time. And we will be posting information along with this session on the GBC resolution that was passed against domestic abuse, and the very good work Rambhoru Prabhu has been doing through the Corona Care education around support that could be had for victims, and also the work that ISKCON Vaishnavi Ministry is doing around raising awareness about these very important issues. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Have a lovely rest of the day. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna Krishna Krishna